The fear of real awakening does not come from outside. It explodes when the soul realizes that the false identity is about to be torn away. That is when the ego collapses, because it only survives within illusion, within the psychological matrix, within the spiritual blindness that sustains the veil of illusion and the veil of Maya. In the Hermetic tradition, preserved in the Corpus Hermeticum and attributed to the lineage of Thoth, awakening was never a comfortable promise. It is brutal inner gnosis, direct knowledge of inner reality, when consciousness breaks the trance of mechanical life and begins to see the naked automatism of the psychological ego. Fear arises because the essence recognizes that seeing the truth requires dying to the constructed identity, to the illusion of the self, to the mental prison that has kept the being away from its true nature for an entire lifetime. Hermes teaches that ignorance is the greatest evil, and here ignorance is not a lack of information. It is living hypnotized by the false identity, believing oneself to be thoughts, impulses, and invisible conditionings without ever touching the center of being. To overcome the fear of awakening is to cross illusion with extreme inner lucidity. It is to sustain presence when the ego loses control. It is to allow the inner transmutation that dismantles the internal matrix without spiritual anesthesia. The great evolutionary leap is not to rise outward, it is to return violently inward to the essential consciousness that observes the ego without confusing itself with it, tearing spiritual blindness apart through self-awareness. When the soul begins to see, the ego calls it a mortal threat, because real awakening is the end of mechanical life and the beginning of inner sovereignty, described by Hermetic alchemy as the purification of the mind and the refinement of being. And if this fear pulsing now is not a sign of error, but proof that the veil is already tearing, what in you still begs to remain in the false identity instead of crossing this portal now? You who are listening now need to understand something without anesthesia. The fear that paralyzes you is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the exact symptom that the false identity is being cornered. When fear rises, it is not because you are doing something wrong, it is because something in you is finally seeing. The ego collapses when consciousness begins to take the center of being. And the practice begins here, now, in you, not in theories. Stop asking for security in order to cross awakening. Security is the illusion itself. Breathe and stay. Stay when everything in you wants to run. This staying is already the beginning of victory. This is how fear begins to lose power. Now listen carefully. The fear of awakening only rules while you try to control it. The real practice is to abandon inner control. When fear arises, do not try to calm yourself. Do not try to elevate yourself. Do not try to understand. Feel directly. In the body, in the chest, in the stomach. This raw sensation is energy imprisoned by the false identity. When you feel without reacting, that energy is released. The ego calls this a threat. The essence calls it a return. You must sustain this point. You were trained to flee from discomfort, and that is exactly what keeps spiritual blindness active. The practice is to invert this conditioning. When discomfort appears, become more present, not less. Bring attention to the now with brutal honesty. Observe the mind trying to create stories. Follow none of them. Story feeds fear. Presence dissolves it. This training seems simple, but it is devastating to the internal matrix. This is how awakening ceases to be an idea. You do not need to eliminate fear in order to awaken. You need to cross it consciously. That changes everything. The practice is to remain present even with fear. Breathe with fear. Walk with fear. Look at yourself with fear without turning it into drama, without turning it into identity. Fear loses strength when it does not become a character, and you begin to notice something new emerging. Now face this directly. Fear is the last barrier before lucidity. It is not an enemy. It is a guardian. The practice is not to fight the guardian. Pass through it in silence, without internal justifications, without asking permission. The false identity needs dialogue. Silence weakens it. When you fall silent inside, something opens, and that something is you. You need to learn to stop explaining yourself internally. This is a concrete practice. Every explanation is the ego trying to regain control. When fear comes, notice the impulse to explain yourself. Cut it there. Remain only with sensation and presence. This cut is inner alchemy. The ego loses ground. Consciousness stabilizes, and fear begins to turn into noise. Daily practice is to remember yourself in the midst of ordinary life. Do not wait for mystical moments. Expect emotional triggers. That is where the work happens. When someone provokes you, when something goes out of control, when fear appears, bring total attention. Observe without reacting. This is the real exercise. This is how mechanical life loses its dominion, and awakening begins to integrate. You need to stop seeking confirmation that you are on the right path. That search is the ego in disguise. The practice is to continue without guarantees, without signs, without validation. Real awakening is inwardly solitary. When fear arises asking for confirmation, do not give it. Stay. This staying builds inner sovereignty, and the leap begins to take shape. The body is your most honest anchor. Use it. When fear rises, feel your feet on the ground. Feel the weight of the body. Feel the breath entering and leaving. The body is always in the real. Illusion lives in the mind. By returning to the body, you return to truth. The ego loses space. Fear dissolves gradually. Now understand this deeply. You are not losing anything real by awakening. You are losing a comfortable lie. The practice is to accept this loss without dramatic mourning, without romanticizing, without resisting. When fear arises saying you will be lost, observe. What is lost is the character. What remains is what always was. This perception changes everything, and consciousness becomes firm. You were conditioned to believe that you need to be prepared in order to awaken. This is false. The practice is to abandon the idea of preparation. Preparation is postponement. Be available now, even confused, even afraid, even without understanding. The ego hates this state. The essence blossoms in it. The fear of awakening feeds on haste. The practice is to slow down internally, even when everything seems urgent. Observe urgency as a mechanism. Do not obey it. Remain present. This deceleration breaks social hypnosis. The ego loses command, fear weakens, and lucidity increases. You need to stop using spirituality as anesthesia. This is an honest practice. When fear arises, do not seek beautiful phrases. Do not seek immediate comfort. Seek truth. Truth is uncomfortable at first, but it liberates. The ego flees from it. Consciousness grows strong in it, and awakening deepens. The practice of inner silence is a powerful weapon. Not only external silence, but inner silence. When the mind begins to comment on everything, stop. Do not argue with thoughts. Do not follow them. Observe. This continuous observing dismantles the ego. Fear arises trying to pull you back. Do not go. Remain observing. You need to accept the inner emptiness when it appears. Emptiness frightens because the ego does not survive in it. The practice is not to fill it, not to run, not to invent meaning. Remain in emptiness with presence. This emptiness is fertile. It is in it that the essence manifests. Fear arises to prevent this crossing. To cross is the leap. Constancy overcomes fear, not occasional intensity. The practice is simple and daily. Presence, observation, non-reaction, again and again. The ego weakens with conscious repetition. Fear loses function. Consciousness stabilizes. Awakening ceases to be an event. It becomes a state. You need to stop protecting yourself emotionally all the time. That protection is the prison. The practice is to allow yourself to feel without armor, without escape, without dramatization. Fear appears when the armor falls. Sustain this point. Something in you aligns deeply, and the false identity begins to crumble. Without violence. Awakening does not happen when fear disappears. It happens when fear no longer decides. The practice is to act consciously even with fear. To speak consciously, to breathe consciously, to choose consciously. Fear becomes background. Presence becomes center. This inversion is the great evolutionary leap, and it begins now. With you listening to this, you do not need to believe anything that is being said. The practice does not require belief, it requires direct experience. Observe yourself today, observe yourself now. At the next fear, at the next impulse to flee, remain present. This is the real path, and it does not turn back. You who are here now need to hear this without filters. The fear moving through you is not a defect. It is the friction between the soul and the false identity. It is the sound of illusion grinding when consciousness begins to occupy the center of being. The practice begins when you stop running from this sound and decide to listen to it with presence. It is not understanding, it is remaining. When fear arises, stay where you are. Do not advance, do not retreat. Feel the inner pressure. This pressure is the ego losing territory. To sustain this is inner alchemy in real time. This is how the veil begins to yield. This is how lucidity is born. You were trained to seek security in order to act, but real awakening happens when you act without inner security. The practice is simple and brutal. Act consciously even with fear. Stand up, speak, choose, breathe, everything with full attention, without waiting for fear to pass, without negotiating with the mind. The ego convinces you to wait. Consciousness acts now. Each conscious action weakens the mental prison. Fear loses command when it no longer dictates movement. This is how mechanical life breaks. When fear appears, observe the automatic attempt to distract yourself. This escape is the food of the internal matrix. The practice is to cut the distraction, turn off the stimulus, stay with what is happening inside, without judgment, without dramatization. Sustained attention is hermetic fire. It burns the layers of the false identity. What remains is naked presence. You need to learn to recognize the exact moment when the ego tries to save you. It saves you by pulling you away from inner truth. The practice is to identify this movement and not follow it. When the impulse to explain, justify, or rationalize arises, stop. Remain silent inside. This silence is not dead emptiness. It is conscious space. The ego does not survive in it. Fear agitates because it loses its voice. Sustain the silence. Clarity installs itself. Awakening does not ask that you become someone better. It asks that you stop sustaining someone false. The practice is to observe all inner masks without trying to remove them by force. See when you want to appear strong, spiritual, resolved. These masks tremble before consciousness. When fear arises, it is because a mask is falling. Do not hold it. Do not adjust it. Let it fall. Each fall opens inner space. Each space is a step in the leap. You need to transform fear into an object of observation, not into identity. The practice is to say internally, fear is present, period. Without my fear. Without story, without past, without future. Just observe sensation. This simple shift breaks the spell. The ego loses the I it clings to. Fear loses its root. Consciousness takes the center. When the fear of awakening arises, bring radical attention to the body. Feel gravity. Feel contact with the ground. Feel the weight of the breath. The body is the antidote to illusion. It does not lie. The mind creates ghosts. By returning to the body, you return to the real. The ego loses abstraction. Fear becomes neutral energy. True Hermetic practice requires conscious repetition. Do not expect a single experience to resolve everything. Layers are resolved. Today one, tomorrow another. Each time you choose presence instead of escape, something shifts. Fear tries to convince you that you are regressing. That is a lie of automatism. Repetition creates inner sovereignty, and sovereignty dissolves fear. You need to accept that real awakening offers no guarantees. The practice is to walk without an inner map, without knowing who you will be afterward, without promises of comfort. This uncertainty terrifies the ego. That is why fear grows. Sustaining uncertainty is the training. This is how the false identity loses control. Consciousness learns to trust itself, and the leap begins to form. When fear appears, observe urgency. Urgency is always of the ego. The practice is to slow down inside, even when everything seems to demand haste. Breathe more slowly. Move with attention. Haste is hypnosis. Presence is rupture. Fear feeds on acceleration. Deceleration dismantles it. You are conditioned to look for answers in order to calm yourself. The practice now is to stop looking. Remain with the living question, without answer, without conclusion. This space without answers is a portal. The ego tries to close it with explanations. Do not allow it. Remain in the question. Inner revelation is born there. The fear of awakening intensifies when you are about to abandon an old identity. The practice is to recognize the silent mourning this generates, without dramatizing, without denying. Accept that something is dying. This dying is symbolic but profound. Resistance to this mourning generates panic. Acceptance generates freedom. Consciousness expands when it accepts losing what was never real. The leap approaches. You need to learn to cross the day with continuous attention. Not only in formal moments, the practice is to bring consciousness to the trivial. Brushing your teeth, walking, listening to someone speak. This attention dissolves psychological automatism. The ego loses space in daily life. Fear loses frequency. Lucidity becomes the base. When fear arises, do not try to turn it into something beautiful. This spiritualization is escape. The practice is raw honesty, to feel what is there, without adornment, without narrative. This honesty dismantles the internal matrix. The ego cannot tolerate direct truth. Fear reveals itself as empty when seen up close. Consciousness gains firmness. The practice of non-reaction is central. Not reacting is not becoming passive. It is becoming sovereign. When something activates you, observe the impulse. Do not execute it immediately. Wait a few conscious seconds. This interval is hermetic gold. There, illusion breaks. Fear tries to push you into reaction. Do not go. Stay. You need to recognize when the ego uses fear to make you retreat from the now. The practice is to refuse retreat, to remain, even uncomfortable, even without understanding. Conscious permanence is the blade that cuts the veil. The ego dissolves when it cannot move you. Fear loses authority. Presence stabilizes. The leap integrates. Constancy is more powerful than any intensity. The practice is small and daily. Presence, observation, non-identification, again and again. The ego grows tired when it finds no drama. Fear loses relevance. Consciousness establishes itself as the base. Awakening ceases to be an event. It becomes a silent state. You do not need to defeat fear. You need to stop obeying it. This is the most direct practice. Observe fear and act consciously despite it. This simple gesture changes everything. The ego loses command. The essence takes the helm. Mechanical life begins to crumble. Inner illusion loses its support. The evolutionary leap happens within, without announcement. Losing the fear of awakening begins when you stop treating consciousness as an idea and start treating it as a living, immediate bodily state, because fear only exists as long as awakening remains abstract. In true Hermeticism, knowledge that does not become being is refined ignorance, and that is precisely what keeps the false identity alive, even when surrounded by elevated concepts. In practice, this means abandoning the attempt to understand awakening and beginning to inhabit attention. When fear arises, do not ask why, ask where. Where in the body does it manifest? Where tension settles? Where the impulse to flee is born? This shift from the mind to direct perception already begins to break the spell. The ego loses ground when you leave the narrative, presence takes command, the fear of awakening feeds on psychological time. It always says, not now, later, when I'm ready. Hermetically, this is mechanical life in its purest form. In practice, every time you notice this postponement, bring attention to the present instant. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Now is intolerable for the ego. That is why it tries to pull you away from it. Sustaining the now dissolves fear at the root. The evolutionary leap requires learning not to react internally. This is not repression, it is mastery. In practice, when an intense emotion arises, neither discharge it nor push it down. Remain still inside. Breathe. Observe. This simple act is a surgical cut into the false identity. The ego survives only while you react. Without reaction, it weakens. Fear loses its function. The Corpus Hermeticum points out that the awakened person is the one who remembers himself in the midst of confusion. In practice, this means remembering yourself at the peak of fear, not in tranquil moments. When the heart accelerates, when the mind threatens to collapse, that is where real practice begins. Bring full attention to the raw sensation. Do not label it, do not interpret it, just feel. This conscious feeling transmutes fear into energy of lucidity. Essence emerges from chaos. The psychological ego fears awakening because it loses centrality. In practice, observe how everything in you wants to return to I, to mine, to my story. This constant return is the mechanism of the prison. When you notice it, let go. Do not fight. Letting go is not giving up, it is withdrawing energy. The ego withers when it does not receive identified attention. Fear is merely the cry of this loss. Allow it to cry. You are not the cry. Spiritual blindness is maintained by identification with thoughts. In practice, treat thoughts as sounds passing in the background. Do not argue. Do not conclude. Do not follow. This training is simple but devastating. The ego needs you to believe thoughts. Without belief, it does not rule. Fear arises trying to force identification. See this happening? That is already awakening in action. The veil of Maya does not fall through effort, it falls through clarity. In practice, clarity is seeing exactly how you flee from yourself. See the distractions, see the compulsion for stimulus, see the need to feel safe. All of this are layers of the veil. Do not try to remove them by force. Observe until they become obvious. The obvious dissolves illusion. Fear cannot withstand lucidity. The body is the anchoring point of consciousness. In practice, use the body as an anchor whenever fear tries to pull you into the mind. Feel your feet on the ground, feel the weight of the body, feel the breath in the chest. The body never lies. Illusion lives only in thought. By returning to the body, you return to the real. The ego loses dominion. Fear fragments. Real awakening does not ask for heroic courage, it asks for brutal constancy. In practice, small acts of presence repeated daily build inner sovereignty. Do not expect mystical experiences, expect silent confrontations with the ego. Each time you choose presence instead of reaction, something aligns. Fear diminishes because it no longer finds openings. Consciousness stabilizes. The evolutionary leap begins to take shape. Without spectacle, without announcement. The false identity needs to be confirmed all the time. In practice, stop seeking external or internal confirmation. Do not ask if it is working. Do not evaluate progress. This is the ego trying to reclaim control. Remain with the naked practice. Presence is enough. Awakening needs no validation. Fear arises when the ego is not confirmed. Sustain this emptiness, it is fertile. Hermetically, transformation occurs through transmutation, not through negation. In practice, do not deny fear. Include it in observation. See it as raw energy, without name, without story. This inclusion dissolves resistance. The ego loses its main weapon, exclusion. Fear ceases to be an obstacle and becomes raw material. Inner alchemy happens. The great evolutionary leap is not crossing an external threshold, it is crossing the last internal attachment. In practice, identify the last thing you do not want to lose. Control, identity, security, spiritual image. Observe the attachment without justifying it. This honest seeing is devastating. The ego is exposed. Fear arises as the final defense. Remain. The mind wants to understand awakening in order to control it. In practice, refuse this attempt. Accept not knowing. Not knowing is a hermetic door. The ego does not enter there. The essence recognizes this space. When fear arises before not knowing, do not resort to concepts. Remain present. This conscious emptiness is liberating. Illusion dissolves without noise. Mechanical life loses power when you act consciously in the details. In practice, do one thing at a time with total attention, without haste, without multitasking. This simple gesture breaks psychological automatism. The ego weakens, fear loses function, consciousness becomes stable. Awakening ceases to be an event and becomes a state. The leap consolidates. The fear of awakening is the guardian of the door. It is not there to destroy you, it is there to test whether you cross without a character. In practice, cross without internal weapons, without mantra, without affirmation, without escape. Only presence. The ego falls because it finds no opposition. The essence passes because it was always there. Fear dissolves along the way. Real awakening requires that you stop protecting yourself internally. In practice, see all strategies of emotional self-protection. They look like care, but they are prison. Letting go of these defenses generates initial panic. This panic is the fear of awakening. Sustaining it without reaction is freedom. Consciousness expands. The false identity loses support. The leap happens silently. Inner gnosis does not announce itself. It reveals itself. In practice, the less you talk internally about the process, the more it advances. Inner silence is a catalyst. The ego needs dialogue to exist. Without dialogue, it weakens. Fear tries to reactivate the conversation. Do not converse. Observe. This silence is pure power. Awakening deepens. The fear of awakening does not disappear all at once. It loses importance. In practice, continue even with fear. Do not wait for it to vanish in order to move forward. Move forward consciously. Fear becomes irrelevant when presence is greater. Clear consciousness occupies the space. Illusion retreats. Essence assumes. The great leap is not an explosion, it is stabilization. And it begins now. Losing the fear of awakening begins when you accept something the ego hates. Fear is not an enemy, it is an alarm that goes off when the false identity is being threatened. In true Hermeticism, this is seen as the beginning of inner gnosis, the moment when consciousness starts to separate from illusion with no return. In practice, the first step is to stop interpreting fear as a sign of spiritual error. Every time you flee from fear, you strengthen the internal matrix. Every time you face it with presence, something breaks. The ego needs you to react. Consciousness only needs you to see. Applying this means remaining still inside when the impulse to escape arises. This inner silence is living alchemy. This is how fear begins to lose authority. Real awakening does not happen when the mind understands, but when the entire body learns to sustain presence. Hermetically, this is transforming knowledge into being. In practice, when fear arises, bring attention to the breath without trying to control it. Feel the air entering and leaving while thought screams. The ego feeds on accelerated thinking. Conscious breathing cuts off that supply. Do not seek calm, seek clarity. Clarity is unbearable for the false identity. Fear diminishes because it finds no narrative. Consciousness begins to stabilize. Another essential point is understanding that awakening does not destroy you, it destroys the character. In the corpus hermeticum, ignorance is confusing oneself with what one is not. In practice, observe how many times you define yourself internally. Each definition is a brick in the mental prison. When fear appears, ask silently, "Who is afraid now?" Do not answer. Remain in the question. This empty space is devastating for the ego. The false identity begins to waver. Fear loses its footing. The evolutionary leap requires learning to remain without inner references. This is what most terrifies the psychological ego. In practice, temporarily abandon all ideas about who you are spiritually. Do not call yourself a seeker, awakened, or conscious. Remain internally naked. This state generates vertigo. That vertigo is the threshold of real awakening. Fear grows before it falls. Sustaining this point is advanced practice. It is there that essence emerges. The ego tries to negotiate with awakening by creating comfortable spirituality. Hermetically, this is false light. In practice, notice when you try to soften the process. Awakening is not violent, but it is relentless. It removes illusions without asking permission. When fear arises, do not look for teachings to calm yourself. Look for presence. Presence does not lie. Presence dissolves. Fear cannot withstand experiential truth. Spiritual blindness is maintained by excess thinking. Losing the fear of awakening requires crossing thought without following it. In practice, treat thoughts as mechanical noise. Do not fight, do not analyze, do not believe. Just see. This constant seeing is what Hermes describes as awakening from sleep. The ego collapses when it is seen continuously. Fear arises as a last resort. Do not retreat at this point. This is the portal. The body is a forgotten ally in practical Hermeticism. In practice, bring attention to physical sensations whenever fear arises. Feel feet, hands, chest tension. The body is always in the now. Illusion lives in psychological time. Anchoring in the body breaks the spell. The ego loses dominion, fear fragments, consciousness stabilizes, presence deepens. The veil of Maya falls when you realize that you do not need to do anything to awaken. In practice, abandon the idea of spiritual progress. Every attempt to advance reinforces the false identity. Awakening is a return, not a conquest. When fear arises, stop trying to resolve it. Stay with it. Feel it. Watch it change. This continuous observation is inner transmutation. Fear exhausts itself. The internal matrix is sustained by emotional reaction. In practice, interrupt reaction. Do not express, do not repress, do not dramatize. Observe in silence. This silence is hermetic power. The ego does not know how to operate within it. Fear needs drama to exist. Without drama, it withers. Essence gains space. Consciousness expands. Real awakening requires the courage to lose psychological ground. Hermes speaks of symbolic death. In practice, accept moments of inner emptiness. Do not try to fill them. Do not seek immediate meaning. Emptiness is fertile. The ego calls it a threat. The soul recognizes it as home. Fear appears to prevent this crossing. Crossing is living practice. The false identity always tries to reassert itself after each insight. In practice, observe spiritual pride arising. This is refined ego. Seeing it without guilt is essential. Observation dissolves the trap. Fear diminishes because there is no longer a character to defend. Consciousness becomes simple. Simplicity is invincible. Illusion loses complexity. Awakening deepens. The great evolutionary leap happens when attention becomes stable. In practice, bring full attention to simple actions. Eating, walking, listening, without internal commentary. This training seems banal. It is devastating to the matrix. The ego loses territory. Fear arises as final resistance. Sustain the practice. Presence prevails. Inner gnosis is not accumulative, it is subtractive. In practice, remove layers of interpretation. See the naked experience, without labels, without story. This direct seeing breaks the veil. Fear finds nowhere to attach. Consciousness reveals itself. Inner truth asserts itself. Real awakening does not promise happiness, it promises lucidity. In practice, choose lucidity even when uncomfortable. This choice weakens invisible conditioning. The ego tries to trade lucidity for comfort. Do not negotiate. Each no given to the ego is an inner leap. Fear diminishes, clarity increases, essence stabilizes, the false identity dissolves. Mechanical life loses power when you remember yourself. Hermetically, this is self-awareness. In practice, remember yourself several times a day, without complex ritual, just presence. This remembering is a blade. It cuts social hypnosis. Fear is only an echo of the old habit. The new state takes hold. Consciousness awakens. The fear of awakening is proportional to proximity to truth. The closer you are, the more intense it becomes. In practice, do not retreat when fear increases. This is the correct sign. The ego is running out of exits. Constant observation disarms it. Presence weakens it. Lucidity dissolves it. The soul recognizes the path. The leap approaches. Awakening does not happen in the future. It happens now or never. In practice, abandon waiting. Waiting is an ego strategy. Stay here, feel, see, breathe. This now is the breaking point of the matrix. Fear does not survive the now. Awakened consciousness does not need external validation. In practice, stop seeking confirmation. The ego lives on mirrors. Essence lives on inner truth. When fear arises, notice the impulse to tell, explain, prove. Do not follow it. Silence strengthens, presence deepens, the false identity weakens, awakening consolidates. Losing the fear of awakening begins when you understand, with your whole body, not with theories, that fear is not of the truth. It is of losing the false identity the ego built to survive within illusion. In true Hermeticism, awakening is leaving active ignorance. It is stopping living hypnotized by mechanical life, and this demands a brutal practice, observing the ego in action without justifying it. In practice, this begins when you interrupt the automatic impulse to explain yourself, defend yourself, and narrate yourself internally, because every narrative reinforces the psychological matrix. Fear diminishes when the observing consciousness grows stronger because the ego only dominates while it is unseen. Applying this is simple and difficult. See, fall silent, and sustain presence while the false identity thrashes. The Corpus Hermeticum teaches that evil is ignorance, and in practice this means not perceiving when you are being moved by unconscious patterns. Overcoming the fear of awakening is training inner lucidity at the exact moment the mind wants to flee, distract itself, or spiritualize the experience. When fear arises, do not fight it and do not try to transcend it. Simply observe its texture in the body and the thought that accompanies it. This act breaks social hypnosis and dissolves the mental prison from within. The ego weakens when it does not receive emotional reaction. The great evolutionary leap does not happen when you feel good, but when you remain conscious in discomfort without abandoning yourself. Hermetically, this is inner alchemy. the fire of full attention burning the impurities of conditioning. In practice, choose daily moments to silence stimuli and observe the mind as an external mechanism. You do not try to stop thoughts, you simply see psychological automatism operating. Fear falls because the constructed identity begins to lose solidity. Real awakening requires dying while alive to the false identity, and this is not poetic metaphor, it is direct experience. Each time you do not react, something in you dies and something more essential is born. Applying this is remaining present when the ego screams that you are losing yourself. That scream is the correct sign that transmutation is active. The soul recognizes the path even when the mind panics. Hermes describes the awakened person as one who wakes from the sleep of mechanical life. In practice, this means perceiving the exact moment you act out of habit rather than consciousness. When you identify this moment, pause for a few seconds and breathe consciously. This small interval tears the veil of illusion more than years of theory. Fear diminishes when presence becomes habitual. Spiritual blindness is sustained by haste, by the search for results, and by the need for control. Losing the fear of awakening requires abandoning haste and accepting inner instability. In practice, observe urgency as a symptom of the psychological ego trying to reclaim command. Do not follow urgency, observe it until it dissolves. This is the real training of awakened consciousness. The veil of Maya falls when you stop identifying with the content of the mind. Hermetically, this is separating the observer from the observed. Apply this by remembering several times a day that thoughts pass but consciousness remains. This simple remembrance breaks the illusion of the self. Fear loses strength because it finds nowhere to attach. The ego calls awakening danger because it feeds on unconsciousness. In practice, every time you observe yourself, the ego loses energy. Use emotional situations as an alchemical laboratory, not as a personal problem. See reaction arise and die without interference. This is direct knowledge, not belief. If you have come this far, it was not out of curiosity. It was because something in you no longer accepts living under the veil of illusion. The fear of awakening is not a mistake on the path. It is the final defense mechanism of the false identity trying to preserve mechanical life. This channel exists to tear that veil, not to comfort the ego, not to sell spiritual fantasy, but to guide you to the direct experience of awakened consciousness, faithful to Hermeticism and real gnosis. If this content touched something in you, do not turn it into just another consumed video. Apply it, observe yourself, sustain presence when fear arises. And if you feel you are ready to go beyond the surface, become a member of the channel, because the next contents deepen exactly the point where most retreat: the death of the false identity, the stabilization of consciousness, the true evolutionary leap without romanticization. Subscribe, activate the bell, and remain here. This is not a channel for those seeking spiritual comfort. It is for those willing to see the truth and not fall asleep again.